Okay, now let's try that again. I think we're okay now. Hopefully, I'll keep an eye on my monitor there. So, to our listeners, this is our one of our remote science salons where we dialogue with scientists and authors when we can't get them in person in our studio in Southern California here. And we're talking to Dr. Gregory Berns, who's the author of What It's Like to Be a Dog and Other Adventures in Animal Neuroscience. If you didn't know that's a field, that's a field. It's something of a sequel to your previous book, How Dogs Love Us. Dr. Berns is a professor of psychology at Emory University and really one of the pioneers of the idea of getting a dog to sit still inside of a MRI machine long enough to scan his brain. I've had dogs my whole life. I now have a dog that looks something similar to this. I have a chocolate lab. His name is Hitch, named after Christopher Hitchens. We call him Hitchy. And so I often sit there and stare at him thinking, what is this guy thinking? What's going on inside his head? And so maybe just by way of background, before we get into all the great philosophical issues that you bring up in the book, it's a great read, by the way, really well written, really compelling, and very moving toward the end when you're talking about animal rights and these are sentient beings. They feel, they suffer. We should care about them, and I'm encouraged that more and more we are doing that. I think this is the kind of research that will push the moral arc a little further along toward justice for other sentient beings, species that are not us. So, by way of background, just tell us how you got into this.
It started as a side project, actually back in 2011. So most of my career has been using functional imaging, primarily MRI, to study how the human brain works. And I spent maybe 20 years or so studying humans with a focus on reward processing and how that eventually evolved into circuits associated with decision making and risk and things like that. And what happened was, I think probably the year before, one of my favorite dogs had died. So that was a pug named Newton.
Newton, yes, I love that. I had a dog named Darwin once.
There you go. We have this rule in my house that all the dogs are named after either scientists or literary figures.
Right. That's great. I love that.
So Newton had died, and in his place we had adopted a terrier whose name is Callie, short for Calypso, but we all call her Callie. And it was around that time where I kind of hatched this idea, and the idea really just originated after the Bin Laden mission, when I saw all these pictures of military working dogs jumping out of helicopters and just doing phenomenal things. And I guess I'd been vaguely aware of it, but just kind of a confluence of factors just got me thinking, like, if dogs can do that, then there's no reason why we can't train them to go into an MRI, which of course is quite loud. It's loud like a helicopter. And then what happened was I just approached a local dog trainer that I'd worked with our dogs and asked him if he was interested in tackling this problem. And he was. He said, let me go in an MRI to see what the parameters are, what the environment's like, and we'll just figure it out how to do it. And then it kind of took off from there.
Yeah, I tried to do an fMRI brain scan when I was writing my book, The Mind of the Market. I was researching some of this stuff on decision making, and I went to a lab at UCLA, and I couldn't stay inside of it. I couldn't believe it. I've never had claustrophobia issues in my life, and it was so loud and just compressed in there. I'm just amazed you get these dogs to sit there. It's incredible.
It's interesting because now what I've learned. So Callie obviously succeeded, and like you said, my first book was more or less about the story of how we did that. And what's interesting about it is that dogs are not concerned with many of the same things that people are in that particular environment. So we don't think that dogs are particularly claustrophobic. They are, of course, quite sensitive to the noise.
Yeah.
And for the viewers and listeners who haven't had an MRI, it sounds like a jackhammer is probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah. Yeah, so you must have used some shaping techniques that behavioral psychologists use to just reward a little bit piece by piece to get in there. and so forth, you use this sort of go no go program or something like that to get in there step by step and stay there a little bit longer.
Yeah, so we just broke it down into pieces. I built simulators of an MRI in my garage and kind of parked these things in my basement. So we had a tube that was up on a table, and it really was just a matter of introducing one element at a time to teach the dogs how to do it. And then with the noise, we would just play recordings of the noise in the background while I played with the dogs, and just gradually increase the volume until they get used to it, and kind of with the whole idea to make it a fun game for them.
Right.
Because they shouldn't have kind of any negative associations going into this.
Right.
So we just try to make it fun. And so we were quite successful with Callie and one other dog, and our first experiments were really just very simple Pavlovian conditioning experiments to see if we could image the reward system like we do in humans and get usable data.
So these are dopamine centers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of simplistic to just call it that, but it's true that the structures that we're focused on are the structures that have the highest density of dopamine receptors in the brain.
So when and maybe for viewers and listeners that are not familiar with the MRI, you always read in the popular literature that the brain lit up or this area lit up as if you're looking at neurons firing, but in fact what you're tracking is blood flow from one region of the brain to another region of the brain, because the presumption is that neurons firing consume a lot of oxygen, so they send signals to draw blood to deliver more oxygen to those particular neurons. So you're really just tracking blood moving around. So you have to set the experiment up where you think this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and so that you can see which areas are lighting up. But it's really just blood flow, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the thing that makes it tricky is that the blood flow changes that we know are associated with neural activity are actually delayed in time. So even though neurons fire in milliseconds, fMRI can't measure it that quickly, and in fact, the blood flow is delayed by about 4 to 6 seconds after that. So,
that long?
Yeah, and it's literally just measuring plumbing, or less generously sewage.
There's still no skepticism about the correlation between the blood movement and the neurons firing. That's pretty solid.
It is solid. There's debate about the biophysical mechanisms that link the two, and whether it's synaptic potentials or firing rates. There's a lot of debate about that, but the correlation is pretty solid. It's been known for over 20 years, I think, at this point.
Yeah, and then the other thing, just technically on that, you always see those colors. The colors aren't there on your screen. Those are added later, right, by statistical programs.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the pretty pictures that you see in all the publications are the result of just massive statistical analysis, because the signals that we're looking for are tiny, a fraction of a percent change in the background of a noise that's 10 times that. So it's just a shorthand way of identifying parts of the brain that have a statistically significant change in activity as a result of something that we do during the experiment.
Right. How many dogs have you scanned now?
Close to 100.
Wow, that's a lot. Because even in human MRI experiments, the ends are usually maybe a dozen or 15 or 20. So that's a lot. And what's happened, so there's kind of two groups. So we actually have we have our core group here in Atlanta, and the number of dogs that we've trained and skinned here is about 40. And then we had a spin-off project actually in California with service dogs. So we did a project with Canine Companions for Independence, where they trained 50 of their dogs to do the MRI to see if we could predict which of those dogs would be good service dogs. Yeah. So this actually has practical applications for useful dogs like this. Okay, that's great.
I mean, we're trying to do a little bit of everything in terms of basic research. So on the basic side, we're really just trying to do kind of top to bottom mapping of the dog brain, especially perception and some of the social aspects of cognition. And then also do some translational work in terms of working dogs. What are the traits that make for a good working dog? Is MRI a more sensitive tool for identifying what's happening inside the dog's mind before it reaches the level of behavior? So those sorts of things.
So, back to the title of the book, What It's Like to Be a Dog. Of course, a lot of our listeners will be familiar with the famous Thomas Nagel paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat. I remember reading that thinking, this seems like a little bit of a red herring, depending on what level you're thinking about that. I mean, technically speaking, I can't know what it's like to be a bat. And if I strapped on all the sensory apparatus and the brain networks that are associated with the apparatus all the way to the point where I would know what it's like to be a bat, I would just be a bat and would have no idea that I'm a human trying to figure out what it's like to be a bat. But technically that would be true for you and I. I have no idea what it's like to be Greg Berns. But I can project myself into your mind. And everybody's heard of theory of mind, and that we all do mind reading, not the psychic stuff we debunk, but that we project ourselves and anticipate what this person might be thinking. And if I were in his shoes, I might be sitting there thinking this, and then he's thinking this about me, so I'm thinking that about him. And we do this pretty regularly in all human relationships. So it doesn't seem a big stretch to go from what it's like to be you to what it's like to be a chimp or a gorilla or a dog or anything really. And the whole fear of anthropocentrism, and that we're projecting ourselves inappropriately into animals. I remember Jane Goodall's getting criticized for this back in the 60s. But really, how can you not, if you've been around animals like dogs my whole life, you can tell when they're feeling guilty or ashamed or happy, sad, angry. They have all these emotions. I mean, this is just blinding yourself and cutting yourself off to a whole rich area of research to think, well, I can't project human emotions and use those words. Why not? We do this with anatomy and physiology and use all the same parallels and evolutionary theory, and of course the correspondences are there. It's almost like there's what I call a cognitive creationism. Like, well, no, evolution didn't really work on the brain. The brain's completely different than all the other organs, even though we use pig hearts and so forth, knowing that there's a correlation there. So why not emotions? And so I think this is really a breakthrough piece of research to say, look, it's okay. And we can even get inside there and see what's going on.
Well, I mean, it warms my heart to hear you say that. It's funny. One of the things I learned very quickly when we started the dog project and started talking about the results and publishing it is you quickly learn that everyone is an expert on dogs.
Yes, right.
But the essay that you referred to, which is now 40 years old, by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, was originally written, he wrote it in reaction primarily to neuroscience, I believe, and kind of this idea that you could reduce mental function to the firings of neurons.
Right.
And the essence of his argument was exactly like you said. It doesn't matter, how much detail we have about the brain. We'll never know what it's like to be a bat. Well, I disagree with that, and not just because of anthropocentric reasons and kind of living with dogs. I think that, for one, neuroscience has come a long way in the last 40 years, and in fact, we know quite a bit more about the relationship of specific circuits, kind of whether it's at the macro level or at the neuron level, and the relationship of those activities to things like perceptual experiences, certainly in humans, because we can report out what we're experiencing. And so we're starting to fill in kind of that big gap between biology and mental experience. And as you said, if it works for humans, there's really no reason why it can't work for other animals. And I agree with you, this question of, the inability to know what it's like to be a bat is a red herring, even at the superficial level, because, of course, now, people put on wingsuits and jump off buildings and mountains, and for all intents and purposes, they look like human bats.
Right.
And they can tell us what it's like.
Right. Scary. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so I also like the chapter because you use a lot of evolutionary theory, which I like to do too, of unpacking a brain and just thinking about what it is that brains do. I mean, brains run bodies, and they map behavior into certain environments, and there's species specific models in brains, and so all species are going to be slightly different in that regard. But on the other hand, all mammals, for example, we're going to have, from a rat brain to a dog brain to a human brain, you got a brain stem, and you got the cerebellum, and you got the hippocampus, and if the hippocampus has to do with memory in humans, it probably does in rats and dogs. So there's certain neural correspondences that are logically there just by deduction from evolutionary theory. And I really liked how you built that in that chapter. So tell us kind of where you go from what we can learn from dogs and so forth from that.
Yeah, I mean, it was when I set out to write this book, that actually wasn't something that I was intending to do because it's an enormous topic, right? And to try to condense it into a bite-sized chapter, but it's unavoidable, I think, when you start comparing species. You have to grapple with the question of what is a brain for? Why do we have a brain? And when you can look at it a couple different ways. You can look at it from the evolution of nervous systems, from simple worm-like creatures up to kind of fully elaborated brains like we have. And the other way you can look at it, which I also think is very interesting, is by analogy to technology, which people don't often think about. But as you kind of go back through the history of neuroscience, you realize that all of our analogies for brain function are simply paralleling advances in technology, right? You go back 100 years and people know about the nervous system in terms of like switches for the most part. And then it evolved to kind of simple computers like they had in the 50s where there was a CPU and memory banks. And now our ways of thinking about it are kind of in terms of parallel processing and connectivity. So a lot of these are analogies, and they're useful analogies, but the take-home message is that when you start looking at brains across many species, you see lots of similarities. And kind of my overriding assumption and what guides me to interpret this is where you see parallel structures behaving in the same way in the brain under similar circumstances in different species, it's completely reasonable to assume that there's a similarity of experience as well. And so many of the dog experiments we've done are simply experiments that have been done in humans. So we've done things like look at how they respond to faces. We look also at how they respond to social rewards. And over we see kind of parallel structures activating in ways that we see in humans. So it's not a reach.
Do dogs have something like a fusiform gyrus and a temporal lobe that activates with faces? Something like what we have, located somewhere up here?
Yeah, indeed they do. In fact, we did that experiment a couple of years ago where we trained the dogs to look at images on a computer monitor in the scanner and just did the human version of the experiment, which is you show pictures of faces, you show pictures of everyday objects, natural scenes, scrambled images, and we found an area of the temporal lobe which respond exclusively to faces. So we called it the dog face area.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about that with in terms of like cross-species differences on what would be important to them. Like dogs can read human faces better than chimps can, which makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. Now we know dogs evolved from wolves, hanging around the perimeters of hunter-gatherer bands and getting scraps or whatever they were doing, and also acting as warning signals to danger and whatnot. So it became sort of a mutualism relationship. So it would make sense for a dog to look at and be able to read your eye gaze, and if you point or you do the cup thing, and a chimp will just sit there and not get the same cues. So clearly there's species-specific, but also in interaction with us, that would make a difference.
Sure, and we can't tell with our experiments how much of this is essentially evolved, like think of it as being hardwired, and how much of it is learned from the environment that the dog lives in, because of course all of our subjects are pet dogs, so they're amply familiar with human expressions. Right. We've thought a little bit as we've gotten more advanced with this and looking at kind of differential responses between different dogs, and that's actually one of the themes of the book, is that when you start asking questions about what it's like to be a dog, that's kind of a silly question in and of itself. The real question is, what is it like to be this dog or that dog? Oh, right. And so with this many subjects, we can start to answer those questions now.
Okay. Did you find any breed differences?
Well, we don't. So breeds are kind of funny, because breeds are defined by physical traits that breeders have selected for. Right. And of course, there's kind of varying degrees of whether a dog is this or that. But we don't have enough variation in our subjects. We have an overrepresentation of retrievers.
Right.
They're popular, and they're also very good at this type of task. Right. And then we have a lot of just mutts from.
I wonder if you could do this with one of those silver foxes in that Russian breeding experiment that they tamed in the 35 generations.
It would be nice. I have not met any of those foxes. From what I've seen of the video, they tend to be fairly high-strung relative to a dog.
Right.
And certainly it would be great to do this with a wolf, but it's the same problem and more dangerous.
I also liked your discussion on encephalization quotient, because I remember reading that research back in the 70s, and then Carl Sagan won the Pulitzer Prize for that his book Dragons of Eden, in which he talked about the triune brain was sort of the thing. I'm pretty sure that's not it's way too simple now, but the idea that you can kind of map on a logarithmic graph, the brain size to body size ratio, and so you'd expect bigger bodies to have bigger brains, but then disproportionately, some species our brains are even bigger. Dogs a little bit more than one, and chimps like 1.2 or 3 or whatever it is, and we're at 1.4 or something. So, and dolphins are up there, whales, and so I guess it's an attempt to quantify something like cross-species intelligence. But then from an evolutionary perspective, you have to wonder to what extent are big brains really all that useful, because most animals are very successful without big brains. They do just fine.
Right.
They have a different kind of intelligence. That's maybe not even the right word. It's like I remember talking to Jared Diamond about this when he opens the Guns, Germs, and Steel book, about how long he would last in Papua New Guinea with his hunter-gatherer friends that he goes birding with there. And they're always considered less intelligent than Europeans and all this kind of stuff. And he was debunking those old myths, that in fact that their intelligence for surviving in a natural environment far outstrips any Westerner. And so we think of intelligence as certain kinds of accomplishments on tasks that we devise, but dogs or bats or whatever, fish, they're perfectly intelligent for their environments.
Yeah, so the encephalization quotient and kind of bigger brains are better idea is interesting, although frankly dated. And one of the things that we've learned in neuroscience, I would say in the last 10 years, is that there are real costs to having big brains. And it's not just the metabolic cost, because of course brains are quite costly to run. But what happens is when brains get bigger, for all that neural real estate to be useful, the neurons have to talk to each other.
Right.
And what you realize really quickly is there's a mathematical relationship here that as brains get bigger, the cost of the neurons communicating with each other increases even faster. I mean, it essentially increases at an exponential rate if you want to keep everything connected. And you can't do that. And you can't do that and fit it into a reasonable sized skull. So what appears to have happened, kind of evolutionarily speaking, is that as brains get bigger, they also break into modules, into essentially self-contained units. And then those units communicate with each other. So we don't understand kind of how that relates to intelligence, but the point is that bigger is not necessarily better because of these costs.
Right. Yeah, it's like Neanderthal brains were bigger than Homo sapiens at the time, Cro-Magnons, for example. But so what? I mean, what we really need to know is what neural networks or modules they had. Did they have a Broca's area for speech, for example? And they try to deduce that from I guess the larynx and something in the back of the skull. Where anyway, so I haven't seen that research in a while. I don't know what the latest is on that, but just the absolute brain size doesn't really tell us much.
Right.
Other than they packed a lot of neurons in there. And so, of course, the folding of the brain, you can pack more in as you fold it up and so on. But as you point out in the book, that just requires more neural wiring to keep them talking to each other. So that's even more expensive to do.
Yeah.
And a related question, you don't really deal with this in your book, but I've always been fascinated by since reading Carl Sagan back when I was in college, the question of what will extraterrestrials be like? Now, in my other area of skepticism, where we debunk alien abductions and UFOs and all that stuff, the aliens always look like bipedal primates, with some gnarly stuff on their forehead, and they speak English with an Indian accent or something. I mean, it's just so obviously concocted by humans in dreams or whatever. But it does bring up an interesting question about parallel evolution, and that, extraterrestrial intelligences. I always say, we're just a one-off, but the argument is made by Dawkins and some others about, well, if you look at evolution anywhere, you're likely to have, the sort of head unit at one end with the sensory apparatus and the waste disposal area at the other end. And you got to have some propulsion things, wings, limbs for walking and so, or swimming, or wings. And so you're going to end up with certain basic architecture depending on the medium, how dense the atmosphere is, or the water, or the gravity on the land. And so maybe it's not too far-fetched to think that an extraterrestrial intelligence would have something like a big brain, and that therefore then we can begin to project ourselves, like you're trying to do here, what's it like to be an ET? And would they be thinking something along the line? Now, Carl was always careful about, we're carbon chauvinists, we're chauvinists all the way down the line, we can't assume they'd be like us. So in Contact, they didn't show what the aliens looked like. It was just a projection of Jodie Foster's father character. So, but still, I mean, you could write a book, What's It Like to Be an Extraterrestrial, and kind of use this kind of reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thought question. So kind of in my treatment of what a brain is for, the thing that's most obvious about why we have a brain at all is because we have bodies.
Something's got to run the body.
Yeah, and why do we have a body? Well, I mean, that I don't have an answer to that question, because that divides us from the environment.
Dawkins' answer is that's the gene's way of being immortal.
Fair enough.
Yeah. The river out of Eden, as he called it, that a chicken is an egg's way of keeping itself alive.
Yeah, fair enough. But the fact that we do have bodies and we have to move them and navigate the environment necessitates a system to do that, and that is what a nervous system is for. And in fact, at least on life on Earth, there's a one-to-one correspondence in life that has bodies and muscles with those with nervous systems.
Right.
So you don't find a nervous system in an animal that doesn't have muscles, right, and vice versa.
Right.
So that's, in my view, why we have brains first and foremost, which is to navigate our environments. So presumably that's true for an extraterrestrial, although it doesn't allow for kind of forms of life that might be more seamlessly integrated with their environment and less separate, which I have a hard time conceiving, but it could be out there.
Yeah. One of the great debates in 19th century evolutionary theory after Darwin was between Darwin and Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace co-discovered natural selection with Darwin. He was the subject of my doctoral dissertation, and I wrote a biography of him. And he made a good argument that Darwin also had a good comeback for it, is that what do you need a brain big enough to be able to do mathematical reasoning or aesthetic appreciation or all the kinds of stuff, write poetry and so on. Really, a chimp's brain for a primate, that's plenty big. A gorilla brain, plenty big. You don't really need, 2 layers more, double the size, triple the size, I guess. What would be, because Wallace argued natural selection only operates in the here and now, just for your immediate environment, for survival purposes only. It's not projecting out, one day we're going to need calculus, so I got to layer on the cortex. No. And so, but Darwin's answer was something like what some people write about today, that, well, it's a byproduct of something else. So, different theories about this, maybe, it's sexual selection. A way of attracting mates is to be really good at poetry and music and, or creativity and humor and all of a sudden the brain starts getting a little bit bigger or whatever. Anyway, so I can't remember why I brought that up, but just as an interesting problem of how you get such big brains and how unusual it is that we do have such big brains that we can even do this. I'm wondering how you answer the question of the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which, of course, you're quite aware. Or is this another one of these red herrings that we can't answer because it's the wrong question? Or is it like what it's like to be a bat and we're wasting time constantly talking about this?
I do think it's not a good question, or I should say it's an ill-posed question, or it's not the right question to be asking. So by the hard problem, I mean, we're talking about how is it that kind of all this wetware gives rise to our mind and consciousness itself. Right. We might not be able to answer that question because, of course, that's because we're machines trying to deconstruct ourselves. But my view of consciousness, so first off, consciousness is not an either-or phenomenon. And I think this is part of the problem in talking about it, because we tend to talk about it as a this or that. You either have it or you don't. When we know every human goes through different gradations of consciousness on a daily basis. So when we're asleep, that's pretty minimally conscious, right? You don't have memory of it. Depending on how deep in sleep you are, you may not be arousable. So that's like a level of above coma, but still, it's a fluctuation in consciousness. So you can take that argument and realize that across other animals, there is also a gradation in kind of levels of consciousness, however you want to parameterize that. And my view is that the complexity of an animal's nervous system dictates kind of the level of consciousness it can achieve. So, for example, I would say that probably most, if not all, mammals are self-aware, at least in a physical sense. Just because no animal seems to confuse their body with something else, so they know where their body ends and they have control over it. So dogs are self-aware in a physical sense. They may not be self-aware in the sense that when we call them by name, that they equate that sound with a sense of I. Humans have, I think, a level of consciousness that goes beyond what I just described, in the sense that we have theory of mind, and so we have an awareness that each other has a mind as well, and probably other species. So it may not be the case, for example, that a dog has a particularly deep theory of mind of humans. They may know that we're living beings, but we don't yet know how deep they model our mental processes. And in fact, they might not have to. Right.
Much of that can be explained by just behavioral conditioning. My dog knows that when I go to that closet, that's where the running shoes are, and that means we're going for our walk because it's in the morning, and he starts getting excited. He's picking up on all these cues without having to think really what I'm thinking.
Right. That's a theory of behavior.
Right.
You only need a theory of mind, in fact, to anticipate behavior. And I think there's a deep truth there, which is that certain animals are better evolved for doing those sorts of computations. So, for example, predators have to outthink the animals that they're hunting.
Right.
So in many cases, those animals have to anticipate where the animal is going that they're hunting. And that requires, I think, a fair bit more mental modeling to occur.
Yeah. We published an article in Skeptic a few years ago by a professional animal tracker who is also a historian of science. And his thesis is that the ability to do science, hypothesis testing, is really the kind of thing trackers do, hunters do. So you look for the animal tracks. And if you see like a little splotch underneath a bush, and you can see that it's less than a day old, and so you think, okay, so the lion or whatever you're looking for was here last night. Now, okay, so let's look for tracks this way. Oh, he went that way. Okay, so if I was him and I got up in the early morning and I went that way and the sun's coming up over here, there's probably water over there, so he's probably gone this far. And then, so that's kind of, this is my hypothesis. Now we test it and go check, and that this is a kind of a scientific way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think that animals do that, although obviously not using that internal monologue.
Right.
But
they're picking up cues.
They are, and I think what's important to realize, and what I think is happening, is it's not simply a stimulus response kind of thing, where they just see this and do that. Right. Because to be successful at that kind of activity requires anticipatory thinking, it requires time shifting, it requires a lot of high-level processing, which we associate with sentient thought.
Right.
We associate it with an internal monologue because we talk to ourselves.
Right. But
that in many ways is irrelevant to the question of sentience and animal consciousness.
Do you make a distinction between consciousness and sentience?
Slightly. I don't think it's a particularly meaningful distinction, and mostly I use the word synonymously.
Right.
And like I said, consciousness fluctuates, so it depends on the particular state. Sentience, I think, is kind of the highest level that a particular species can achieve on this scale of awareness.
Yeah. I think a lot of philosophers and people in general, when they think about consciousness, they think of it as what we do, like what you and I are doing now. When in fact, dogs are conscious, rats are, all animals are conscious to a certain extent. Even if it's just the basic level, like you said, this is where my body ends, that's where the environment begins, and I can move around and navigate in this environment. And there's areas of the brain we know that have to do with, not sort of mental maps of, this is where the table starts, so I have to move around it this way. And that's all part of consciousness. And, in Dan Dennett's book, what's the Freedom Evolves, he used this idea of degrees of freedom from mathematics, but applied to the complexity of the organism itself, its nervous system. And that the more complexity you have over evolution, the more degrees of freedom you have. And he's arguing for a compatibilist position on the free will question. And that, determinists don't completely buy this argument, but that, if I could go this way, this way, this way, this way, but the rat can only go between these two parameters here, but mine are this way, I have more degrees of freedom. It's a kind of way of choosing which path you take in your environment. I'm wondering what you think about this whole, I don't know if you're a compatibilist or determinist. Most scientists are not libertarian free will, but I wonder how you square that circle, or if it's another one of those questions that we, like consciousness, we just can never answer.
Yeah, I'm fairly deterministic, totally reductionistic. Honestly. So my view of kind of consciousness, what it is it's a bit of a dodge, but I don't think it's anything more than the communication between neurons. It is the flow of information, and it's not. It's one and the same. The flow of information and consciousness, to me, are the same thing. And the reason I say that, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, is when you study disorders of consciousness, you see that they mostly result from what we call disconnection syndromes. Right. So when parts of the brain become disconnected from other parts, you have a disorder of consciousness. So kind of in a blunt head trauma, coma, right. It's not typically the case that a particular region has been damaged. It's kind of more of just a global stunning of the cortex and separation from brainstem centers that control arousal. And what's interesting is when people come out of comas, these systems come back online unequally. They don't all come back at once. And this is kind of one of the great advances, I think, in rehab medicine in the last decade, is this realization that when people emerge from comas from head injury, that you have some systems that are tremendously excitable and others that are essentially, disconnected from that. And this is why people can go, screaming down the halls, running out of buildings, completely unaware of what they're doing and have no memory of it. And one of the things that doctors do now to treat this is they decrease the sensory load on the person. So everything is quiet, dim. And this is an advance because in years past, they used to just sedate people, right? And so, to me, it's the flow of information is consciousness itself.
Well, I was getting great value from my work as a skeptic reading Oliver Sacks's books, because all of his books are about case studies of when somebody had this particular problem go wrong in that particular area of the brain, and look what the effects are. And so when people tell me about their alien abduction experiences or their ghost experiences or whatever, it's like, yeah, but read chapter 7 in Oliver Sacks's book. The person had a similar experience, and we know there was a tumor right there, or a stroke right there, the fusiform gyros, the face blindness and all that stuff. We know it's mapped right there. So it's not coming from outside, but the fact is you don't perceive your brain operating, so it just seems like it's coming from outside, even though it's still inside here. But let me just push you just a little bit on the free will thing. Just one more point. I don't want to get too bogged down in that. But, there's that famous study, the case study of the guy, Mr. Oft, he's called, the 40-something-year-old school teacher, all of a sudden becomes inappropriate with his stepdaughter. His wife catches him, and he's got kiddie porn on his computer, and so he's in big trouble. And just before they haul him off to jail, they scan his brain because he was acting really weird. He's got a tumor in the hypothalamus, pressing up against his hypothalamus. So they take the tumor out, and all the pedophilic feelings he had go away. He's back to normal, everything's great. Then all of a sudden, 6 months later, the wife finds kiddie porn back on his computer, and I'll haul him back in. The tumor grew back. Okay, so for this guy, we don't think, he's a pedophile. He's one of those evil, bad pedophiles. He's a medical patient. He's got a tumor. So the question is it tumors all the way down for you and I, too? I mean, you don't have a tumor. I don't have a tumor. But maybe we just have something else in our background that leads us to do this or that or choose this profession or whatever. I mean, would you think of it that way, or would you think, well, Mr. Oft is actually qualitatively different than you and I? He has, in Dan's words, fewer degrees of freedom. He's restricted by brain injury or something that you and I are not restricted by, so you and I have more degrees of freedom. So we should be held more accountable for our behaviors.
Yeah, these are kind of moralistic questions more than scientific ones, right?
Yeah.
Because they kind of get at the heart of accountability.
Yeah,
really.
But you guys, neuroscience and the law, this is a big thing now, right? They're really
huge.
Yeah.
I, however, am not really a fan of kind of the merging of neuroscience and law.
Okay.
For many reasons. One is that there's huge individual variations. And so way back, well, not way back, probably about 10 years ago, Supreme Court, when they were weighing cases of punishment for juvenile offenders, took this issue up, and essentially they banned capital punishment for juvenile offenders, and eventually they banned essentially no possibility of parole. And part of that argument was based on neuroscience, supposedly, that essentially teenagers have immature brains and therefore cannot be held fully accountable. However, the flip side of the argument is there are plenty of teenagers with brains who are probably more mature than most adults, right? And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have older people whose brains have probably deteriorated to the point where they're even worse shape than teenagers. Right? We don't seem to cut them.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. The law has these categories that they put everybody in, and as a scientist, you're saying there's too much variation.
Right, and so I think the law reflects society's moral intuitions and judgments, and so there may be mitigating circumstances in particular cases, and so the tumor may be a mitigating circumstance, but it's very rare that I think that we allow people an out for their behaviors based on anything, really.
Right, right.
Insanity defenses are exceedingly rare.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you can make them, but they're not gonna succeed very much. Yeah, right. Well, and then the other philosophical part I really liked about your book is on animal rights, because I've written about this in my book, The Moral Arc. I have a whole chapter on that. And I open with when I was in the Galapagos with my friend Frank Sulloway and we were on one of these islands where the government had decided to kill every last goat. The goats had been introduced in the late 19th century by sailors and so on. It's just sort of free meat on the hoof. And but they eat the vegetation that the tortoises eat, and the tortoises have been there about 6 million years. The goats, a century. Okay, so we made the moral decision: the goats got to go. And these are I have a picture of me holding one of these cute little baby goats, and it's, oh my God, this little thing. He didn't choose to be there, and yet but the tortoises are probably going to go extinct, so. They sort of make that moral triage decision, and then they kill. I mean, thousands and thousands of them, and they brought in these professional hunters, and they couldn't get every last one because it's a really craggy, harsh environment. So they brought in helicopters. They still couldn't get them all. So then they introduced some goats with collars around, radio collars. They called them Judas Goats. So they would go find the other goats, and then they would track them, and then go in and kill them all. I mean, it's just brutal, And then I also told a story about the worst thing I ever did. I was in graduate school. I was working in a behavior lab with rats and pigeons. We were running operant conditioning experiments on choice, the matching law. Would they match the number of bar presses or key pecks to the doubling the reinforcement, that kind of thing. Anyway, but at the end of the experiments, it was my job as a graduate student getting paid to help the lab. It was to exterminate essentially the rats. I had to put them in a big bag and pour this, I think it was chloroform or something. It was just terrible. I can't believe I did it, and I feel sick about it. And so when I read your section about when you were in medical school and your professor came over and said, "All right, it's time to cut." I guess you had to cut the carotid or the heart artery to make sure he was dead. And you felt terrible, but yes, absolutely. This is incredible how much more sensitized we are now to the sentience or as you quote Jeremy Bentham, as do I. It's not can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer? And there seems to be no question most animals can suffer. I mean, maybe even salmon. I don't know. I've been reading stuff about some of the animal rights activists. I'm not sure I trust all their research because they're activists. But all the way down, you shouldn't even be eating fish. Like, whoa, boy, how far down the scale do you take those kinds of arguments? I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. So, I mean, Bentham, of course, made the realization that, obviously animals suffer and kind of founded the animal welfare movement, which the thing that interests me about animal welfare is not so much the realization that animals suffer, because as you said, I think, certainly in this country, people are very much aware of that and becoming increasingly sensitized to that fact. The question I'm interested in is actually one beyond that, because I take it as a given that, yes, animals should have a right to a life without suffering. Do they have a right to, for lack of a better word, flourish in the way that they're evolved to live?
Right.
Kind of, like it says in our Declaration of Independence, right?
Yes, right.
Do they have some kind of inalienable right, to live, the way they evolved to live?
Yeah.
That's an extremely difficult question, and it's particularly a problem, I would say, for the megafauna on this planet, which are rapidly disappearing and probably may be gone in our lifetime.
Yeah.
And the issue there is if you take a species that's on the verge of extinction, northern white rhino, where there's something like 3 of them left.
Yeah.
Under 24-hour guard.
Right.
How do you weigh that species' rights against people that live there who to eat? Everything that is kind of currently in the canon of our laws would favor humans.
Yeah.
Even if, and I've argued with Peter Singer about this. He says it's not true, and because he says that animals' interests should be taken into account. But what I say is, well, the only people who are weighing these interests are people,
Yes, right.
right? So there's only human courts of law, and it's always tipped in favor of humans.
Well, that's why if you grant animals personhood, I think that's what Peter wants to do. Is like grant personhood legal status, even though they're not persons.
Right. And my take on it is, I mean, we do need to have some kind of system for advocating for these animals when their interests conflict with humans in a way that the scales are not tipped always in favor of humans.
Right.
And it kind of sounds harsh, but should a species that's on the verge of extinction, should they have kind of more considerations than one who's not?
Right.
I don't know the answer to that question because that's kind of it's a question that we're going to face increasingly.
Yeah, it's like the moral triage of the Galapagos. Somebody has to decide. Something's got to go. Well, I mean, part of the solution, I think, is economic prosperity for people everywhere. Because to be an animal rights activist, you have to have a certain amount of prosperity just to even care. Like if you're worried about where your dinner's coming from, you know, who cares about the dog or the white rhino, right? So just getting everybody wealthier and more prosperous, which will also, by the way, decrease populations because wealthier, more educated people have fewer children, and you know, if we can get over the hump around 2050 and start back down and get back to maybe 5 or 6 billion by 2100 or something, maybe down to a couple of billion in a sustainable environment, then maybe those animals can flourish. You know, maybe this is something of a pipe dream. I speculate at the end of the moral arc. But have you seen these farms? I call them happy farms. You know, where the cows and the pigs run around and they're happy, and the chickens and so on. They're free to basically live out their physiological existence, you know, in their, you know, sort of right to, and everything's great until the day that they, you know, kill them for food. And, you know, I've seen some documentaries on those films, particularly contrasted with the factory farms, which are just terrible to watch. Those hidden cameras are just painful to watch those documentaries. It seems like that's a step in the right direction, of along the lines that you said, of, you know, flourishing the way they were meant to be. The chicken can run around, or the pig, or whatever, you know, bathe the pig, and so on. But we still eat them.
Right. Yeah, it is definitely a step in the right direction. And you know, the difficult thing to face is the answer to these questions is always the same, which is just don't eat animals.
Yes,
which is
of course,
which is easier said than done, and it's something I struggle with too. You know, I don't eat much meat, but it would also be dishonest to call myself a vegetarian or a vegan.
Right.
And most data shows that people who call themselves that are, you know, not totally that anyway.
Right.
And the problem with those labels is that they are, you know, essentially like religious labels.
Right, and then you fall off the wagon, and then you're a sinner, you know,
right.
And it's a moral crime against others. It's like, oh boy, you know, and then you feel super bad about doing it. So, do you know the reducitarians? This little movement of
Yep.
yeah. So
yep.
You know, just cut it back. You know, meatless Mondays and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, and these are all incremental steps, and you know, but as far as, you know, the other wildlife, I think we all suffer from myopia in terms of, you know, just looking out for, you know, our own immediate interests, but I think there's also the fact is that we're all on the same planet, and anything that helps these other species is going to help us as human beings as well eventually, because I mean, we have obvious resource constraints. We have obvious climate change.
But again, a technological solution. I posted this article the other day about synthetic leather. You know, because the carnage in the leather industry is just, you know, staggering. How many animals they have to kill to make leather for cars and clothes and belts and shoes and whatever. It's, you know, it's not the kind of thing most of us even think about. Anyway, but there's a company, now there'll be more companies once they start making money at producing synthetic leather. And you probably know the Google guys. I think Larry Page is the one that's behind the synthetic meat. You know, just growing your steak in a test tube,
Right.
burger in a petri dish. And what's the name of that company? Memphis Meats, I think it's called. It was by a cardiologist, founded by a cardiologist who was growing heart muscle from stem cells. And it's like, well, that's meat. It's a steak, a little mini steak.
Yeah.
So ultimately, because let's face it, meat tastes good. I mean, it's really good, and it's like, I hate to say it, I like meat, but if it was just synthetic and no animals were killed, okay. So in other words, I'm making an argument that it was shifted from a moral question to a technological problem.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, if I would happily eat a test tube burger and not have any qualms about it at all.
Right. You wouldn't feel squeamish or weird about it?
Why? I mean,
if you can't tell the difference, right?
Cells, right?
Right,
So,
that's right, yeah. Well, some people say they find the idea creepy, but then again, it's just what you get used to. I mean, back in the '80s with in vitro fertilization, it was like, oh no, this is terrible. We're playing God. We can't do this, And then now everybody does it. It's no big deal, and that's why I'm not terribly worried about CRISPR. It's just another step in curing human diseases. Oh, but what if after they cure cancer and Alzheimer's, everything, somebody wants to have blue-eyed babies? So what? But then the concern is, well, but then what if the Nazis want to make, Aryan? Okay, let's just deal with that when we get there. But first, cure the cancer and the Alzheimer's. Okay, it's like my next book is on the search for the afterlife. It's called Heavens on Earth. So I write about these, radical life extensionists and the cryonics people and the transhumanists and the mind uploaders. And Shermer, don't you want to live to be 500 years, 1,000 years? I tell them, look. Just get me from like now to 80 without getting cancer, and 80 to 90 without Alzheimer's, and 90 to 100 without senility, and maybe 100 to 110 without being test tubes plugged into a life support system in a bed somewhere, and I'll be happy. And then from there we could take it from there. It's incremental steps. I think is a better way to go than these. But we have this idea of we can create utopia now. Let's make the huge leap now.
Well, I do talk about CRISPR at the end of the book, more in a sci-fi sense that, it will be used, no doubt about it. It's already being used. Right. And, it's just a matter of time before it goes beyond, disease curing to, tinkering with human evolution.
I love the end there where you homo... hominis? Was it?
I called it homo hominis. Yeah,
I like that. Yeah. H hominis. Yeah. So, but in a way, as the evolutionary psychologists have been pointing out for the last quarter century, we kind of do this anyway with mate selection.
Sure.
Evolution sort of programmed into us emotions that make us favor certain people over others, and there's good genetic reasons for why we do that already anyway. So, would technology just be an extension of that?
Absolutely. It is absolutely an extension, and sexual selection operates much more quickly than natural selection, and as far as we know, typically results in often runaway processes where you just get massive exaggeration of traits. So I can totally see, not too distant future, a kind of a runaway selection for. I don't know what it would be called at that point, technological prowess, technological incorporation in the body. Not sure what it would be.
Yeah, I haven't followed the CRISPR that carefully to know if there would be pleiotropic effects, so that if you snip these genes here, it's going to have effects on some other part of the chromosome that you didn't anticipate, and then you end up with some traits, like with the silver foxes. They bred for domesticity, and they got the floppy ears and the curled tail and the little splotches on the forehead that they weren't breeding for that at all. And I do wonder with CRISPR, I just don't know, if you started snipping this and that to get rid of cancer or whatever, all of a sudden you end up with something you weren't anticipating.
Most certainly.
Okay, well then that would be it, because then maybe I'll agree with you on that.
It's hubris to think that we actually know what we're doing.
Yes, right. Yeah. Well, and then the AI equation comes into it, and expanding the moral sphere to include animals. How far down the chain do you go? Again, do you eat fish? And does it feel intuitively like fish is more okay than, say, cows? Because that's sort of how I feel about it.
It does, but there's no logic to it. And in fact, you could argue that eating a fish is worse because one cow can feed a lot of people, and a fish can only feed one or two.
Right.
So, but that's a conversation for a different day.
Yeah. What? Where are you going to go from this book? What's the next project?
Well, I'm very interested in these other species besides dogs. So
I love the sea lion stuff. I've been up into that area because I live in California, so I've been up to Monterey Bay and all that stuff, and I've seen the seals out there and all that. I had no idea that they could get those weird diseases where they're flopping around on the beach and they have the brain stuff.
Yeah, so kind of one of my passions right now is, we started a side project trying to map in detail the white matter architecture of various exotic species like dolphins and sea lions, and even went to Tasmania to try to reconstitute the brain of the extinct Tasmanian tiger. So I'm very passionate right now about something I call the Brain Arc, which is kind of a small initiative to try to digitally catalog the architecture of as many mammalian species as we can before they disappear,
right,
in the hopes that we can learn more about what is it in the brain of, say, a bear that makes it a bear and not a tiger or a lion.
Right.
And if we can link that to their adaptability in terms of in the face of changing habitats, then maybe we can identify species that need more help than others and intervene.
Yeah.
It's kind of a bit of a pipe dream, but that's...
Oh, no, I love it. No, I love that chapter in the arc. It's like J. Craig Venter doing the, just getting a sample of every species on Earth and storing their DNA in a big freezer or whatever, just in case they go extinct. We can bring them back when we have the technology to do so. And I was thinking about dolphins and whales, and all the cetaceans. On the ET question, you could get a species that evolves all the way up to having a massive brain, on the EQ scale, it's way up there like us, but they live in the water. And they have flippers instead of hands, so they can't make radio telescopes and spacecraft, so we won't even know that they're there. Short of going there, and so yet that's a completely sophisticated form of intelligence, whatever it is. I remember there was the guy Sagan wrote about this in one of his books of who was it? John C. Lilly, the guy.
John
Lilly. Yes. But he was so far out there. I think he was giving acid to some of these dolphins to see what they could do. It's just too much. But here's a species that their environment is so different from ours, and their bodies are so different. Even though they have massive brains, it would be even harder to know what it's like to be a dolphin than a dog, I would think.
You would think, and that's actually what drew me to studying their brains. So we've done fairly detailed scans on dolphin brains, and one of the big questions is, how do they use sonar? How do they echolocate? And there's kind of been this idea that sound has displaced the visual parts of their brain by evolution because they don't have as much need for it. So we actually tested that idea by doing what we call track tracing in this type of imaging to see how their auditory systems are wired. And what we found was that they actually look very much like terrestrial mammals. And so you can kind of start to put the pieces together and realize that they're not as different as you might initially think. So they hear in a very different frequency range than we do, because they live in water, and sound travels much faster in water than in air. So they have to have the ability to discriminate frequencies at a much finer level than we do. But we can understand that. It's not beyond our ability to understand what it's like to be a dolphin in that sense, because in fact, their hearing behaves much the way ours do, and it's also not the case that they're the only species that can echolocate, because humans can echolocate.
That's right.
Actually, not too bad. Anyone can walk into a completely pitch black room and have some sense of the dimensions of the room and what the surfaces are made of, just by the sound.
Right. Yeah, you can tell if there's carpeting and drapes or not, and so forth. Yeah. Yeah. So. What was I going to ask on the? So of course, dolphin brains are mammalian brains, and those brains were once on the land, so they've got to have most of the stuff that we have anyway. I know. I was going to say, do you know Donald Hoffman's theory about perception? He's a UCI neuroscientist, and he has a book coming out about all this stuff that Deepak Chopra is all excited about, because basically it's that all perception of reality is based on your species, and that it's sort of a kind of the most extreme version of this, that the reality to the bat or the dolphin or whatever is completely different than yours and I's, and we can never really know what reality is. It almost gets to an epistemological level. But I argue that's okay. So the bat is flying here and it's echolocating. There's really a book here, and whatever this looks like in his brain, I don't know, but he's going to go around it because there's really something here. And a dolphin, whatever a shark looks like to a dolphin, it's probably different than whatever it maps onto my visual cortex. There's still a pointy end with teeth at one end and a fin at the other end that propels it, and it's still a dangerous predator. So there's something mapping on there that there's a reality that I would think corresponds.
I agree completely, and that is really the heart of the argument of the book. That I mean, we do inhabit the same environment. We live on the same planet, and there's, like you said, there's physical reality to the things out here.
Right.
It's not. I mean, yeah, our perceptions are constructed in our head, but if they weren't tethered to reality, we wouldn't be here.
Right. Right.
You'd be dead. You'd be eaten long ago.
Right. Yes. Right. Yeah.
And I'm, and my eyes glaze over when philosophers talk about qualia. It's like,
yes.
There's, to say that your red is different than my red is, to be honest, just ridiculous, because color itself is a physical property
That's right.
of light.
Right.
And we can say 650 nanometers. That's the wavelength of red, whatever.
Yeah, one of my favorite epigrams that I use in a chapter of my next book from Wittgenstein, talking about the afterlife. And he says, the important question is not, is the afterlife true or not, but what problem this solves? What are you trying to get at? What do we want to know? Because you can just talk about this endlessly. What's consciousness, free will, what's reality, blah, blah, blah. We have a few glasses of wine, and late into the night, it's fun, but then tomorrow, okay, now what? You still have to act in the world. So, I'm kind of more of a pragmatist in that regard. What can we learn from this and go forward? So to that extent, I really like your work because I think it's important. I do think animal rights and all that is important, but just in terms of like the deep understanding of evolution, which still is a problem in America and other areas. People just have this intuition that we're different. And the more we can just sort of pound away that, we're all, from a common ancestor, we all have certain characteristics. And the reason I love your work is because everybody loves dogs and everybody thinks they understand dogs, as you said. So, to be able to say, yes, okay, I can, there's a real continuity there, I think expands the moral sphere. It just intuitively, the way you think about other animals that are not dogs. It's like, well, dogs are like me, then what about dolphins or cows or whatever? And I love that you got Temple Grandin as your, because when I read her book, the first one, basically what it's like to be a cow, where she put herself in the chute, like going through the chute, heading for the the big room there, and that they're seeing these dangly things on the gate, and this is super bothersome. That you and I, standing a few feet taller, would not see that. And I thought, boy, I just had never thought about that.
Yeah.
And that she had a little more insight because of her autism, obviously high functioning. But so anyway, all those kinds of intuitions I think are important for all of our just sensitivities, moral sensitivities. I don't know if you read Steve Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, but he has that whole chapter on how people used to treat animals, centuries ago. Bear baiting and cockfighting and the cat burning. I mean, just let's burn cats for fun. I mean, we don't even think about that anymore. Well, most of us hopefully don't think about that. I think bullfighting is about the last of and that's got to go pretty soon. I think it's pretty much on its way out. Hopefully. Yeah. So anyway, well, thank you, Gregory. Thank you so much. Again, the book is, What It's Like to Be a Dog. It's a great read, really fun. Congratulations on that, and keep up the good work.
Thanks.
Right.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining the salon. All right. See ya. Bye-bye.